Hey, before we get going, today's episode is brought to you by Growers & Co. Growers & Co. is the brainchild of Jean-Martin Fortier, the market gardener, who is working to create a tool and apparel company that is for growers, by growers. The goal of Growers & Co. is to be a brand that represents the dignity, skills, and creativity required to do this work. Since I've known JM, he has been working on this idea, and I have to say, he and his team have kind of knocked it out of the park. I'm not going to lie. I'm kind of obsessed with the Brandywine straw hat and the Muscovich vest. Hannah has been rocking the Oxheart shirt like crazy. All of this apparel is well made and well fitted, but Growers & Co. is more than clothes and tools. They are also launching a biannual magazine that is dedicated to the culture of small-scale farming. I will be contributing to that magazine with several other farmer writers. It's going to be rad. Learn more at growers.co. Today's show is also brought to you by BCS America.
BCS two-wheel tractors power dozens of professional quality, PTO-driven attachments for soil working, mowing, property maintenance, snow removal, and more. BCS tractors are famous for their durability and versatility, with handlebars that rotate 180 degrees for front and rear mount implements. And now, BCS has introduced a game changer in the two-wheel tractor world, Model 770 with hydrostatic drive. Model 770's Easy Grip lever enables the operator to precisely select ground speed and direction of travel without the need to shift or vary the throttle. This is extremely useful for heavy mowing or snow clearing jobs where constant changes in direction or speed are necessary. Now you can keep the flail mower running at full RPM while you mow forward, reverse, and forward again, all without the need to shift or re-engage the PTO. The hydrostatic Model 770 is on sale now. Check out bcsamerica.com for sale pricing and to find your nearest dealer. That's bcsamerica.com.
All right, let's jam. Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 1 of season 3. Another season, another year of soil nerdy gardening goodness, and I have an awesome episode to kick it all off with. In fact, this interview was going to be one of the last interviews for last season, for season 2, but with COVID, the scheduling just sort of fell apart, and we weren't able to get it recorded until recently. So for that reason, and well, because Jan-Hendrik's system is really fascinating, I thought we would kick it all off with this one. First, Jan-Hendrik Cropp is a consultant in Europe, stationed in Germany, and I'm super excited to hear what you all think about his system of hay and haylage mulching from a fallow field. It's definitely one of the more unique systems I've come across, but holds a lot of promise for a wide variety of scales. And I've been wanting to explore hay and straw mulching more in their many forms this year because I kind of feel like this is an area I've been neglecting. Sorry about that, but don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're getting it and to the No-Till Growers YouTube channel. Other than that, enough from me. Let's get into this amazing conversation with Jan-Hendrik Cropp of Undercover Consultancy. Jan-Hendrik Cropp, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to speak about my work.
Yeah, and I'm super happy to have you. Okay, so give us a little context about your work. Where are you located and what do you do there?
I am based in Berlin and I'm running like a small freelance business which is called Undercover Consultancy. And we're basically doing consultancy work on soil fertility and soil health, mostly for organic farmers, but sometimes also for conventional colleagues. I mean, what we've been focusing on, or me especially, is no-till cropping systems in organic farming, and also other mulching systems in like mostly vegetable cropping systems, so like horticulture.
Are the no-till systems there? Is that sort of something that is just now kind of coming into popularity, or has that been around for a while now? Like in the States, it seems like no-till is just now really kind of coming into popularity, or at least people are starting to figure out the systems. Is it kind of the same thing in Germany?
Well, I would say the main difference between Europe and the States is that in the States, due to GMOs and like herbicide-resistant crops in conventional farming. I think you have like in conventional farming, you have a much more widespread no-till approach than we have in Europe, where we don't have GMOs and broadband herbicides or like crops that are resistant to herbicides. So my feeling always was, I traveled to the States a lot in Canada, that there was much more pressure on organic farming in the States because conventional colleagues are tilling so little. And I think that's different here. So both conventional and organic farmers are still tilling a lot. And I think that makes, there are some conventional farmers who are really trying to realize no-till systems, but in organic farming, it's a very new development, and there are very few farmers who actually do it, I would say. Also because we have like colder summers compared to the States, which is one big struggle, I think, to put these systems in place in Europe, that we just simply don't get, especially for summer crops like soybean or corn, which is, I think, the most widespread no-till systems in organic farming in the States. We simply don't have enough heat to combine like a cover crop and a cash crop in a no-till system.
Right. Yeah. If you're pushing down a bunch of, like, even in an organic system, if you're pushing down a bunch of ryegrass or something, you're going to be planting into some pretty cold soil.
Yeah.
And then what are the main crops? I mean, what are in terms of like German agriculture, not doing a lot of corn and soybeans, or is that just not doing a lot of corn and soybeans in terms of like or sort of organic no-till?
No, I think generally soybeans are a new development in Europe. I mean, there is more and more regions where you can actually grow soybeans in Germany due to climate change. But I think if you went back 10, 20 years, there wouldn't be soybeans at all, maybe with the exception of very southerly parts of Germany. So that's really happening, especially in organic farming, also in terms of trying to produce regional feed for organic cattle and other like livestock. But I mean, the main crops are, I would say, winter wheat, winter barley, corn, which is a lot of silage corn. There's some cereal corn, canola, sugar beets. I think that's the big, like when you talk about large-scale arable farming, that's the big player.
Okay. All right. That gives me some good context. Okay. So I want to start with soil fertility with you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know we have a lot of stuff to dive into. In your eyes, like, what are some of the key components to soil fertility? Like, what are some of the things you're kind of working with farmers on?
Yeah, I'm sticking. I'm sure that in your podcast, those 4 principles that we are working with have already been mentioned. So whenever I'm introducing my seminars, I'm talking about 4 principles. The first would be to disturb the soil as little as possible. The second would be to cover the soil with dead organic material, if possible, the whole growing season. The third would be to have a living root in the soil for most of the growing season. And the fourth would be to create diversity. And those are the kind of 4 principles that we try to develop our cropping systems around.
Great. So what is that? Okay, so I've seen some of the webinars in that you've done, and the one on fresh hay mulch, which I think really covers well all of those principles. I'm hoping that we can dive into that system to get an idea of how it works. So can you give us first like an overview of this sort of mulching system, and then we can go through sort of each part individually?
Yeah, so if we're talking about vegetable farming, what we started with when we started to develop those systems was that we were more thinking about a system where you had till soil, where you would do your conventional tillage, so to speak, and then cover your vegetable beds with fresh cuttings of clover grasses or alfalfa grass, or any kind of or grassland, like any kind of perennial legume grass mixes. So the idea was to chop those clover grass or hay fields and transfer the fresh material directly onto the vegetable beds. Like options of this would be to use, I think you would say haylage maybe, like anaerobically with lactic acid fermented kind of clover grass cuttings. If the timing isn't right, like if you can't do the cutting right at the point where you need to cover your bed, or to use hay as well. So those would be the options, but we've been mostly working with fresh cuttings or haylage. So that's what we started out with, and then we had the challenge of how to plant into those deep mulch beds. And what we came up with is that we had to develop a planter that can kind of cut a slit into the deep mulch and then put in the transplant through this sliced deep mulch, if you want. So that's what we did. The planter is, I mean, I don't know if it's available yet in the States, but that's what we achieved to kind of develop this technology, and this made it possible to work in these systems. That's maybe more the historical background, and if you talk about the three systems that we work with in horticulture, the first would be this system where you till your soil just like you do it on your farm regularly. You transfer the mulch. That would be, we're working with around, if it's a fresh cutting, we work with around 75 tons per hectare. I don't know what the pounds per acre would be. You would maybe you can do the calculations yourself, but that's the number we work with, like 75 tons per hectare. So that would be the first system. The second system would be a pure no-till system, which is what you're familiar with in the States as well, I guess. So you grow a cover crop. Usually it would be a winter cover crop, like a mixture, for example, of triticale, winter pea, hairy veg, those kind of crops. And you roll down with the roller crimper, you roll down the cover crop. When it bloom or it's the cover crop is setting first seeds, and then you basically no-till with no tillage into this bed. That's also possible with the transplanter we developed. So that would be the second system that you might be more familiar with in the States, as far as I know. I mean, I've seen a lot of, especially conventional farmers who work with these no-till systems in vegetable farming. And the third system, which is what we found, which is like what we've come up with and settled with at the moment, which we like most, is actually a combination of the two systems. So you grow a winter cover crop, for example, the mix I just mentioned, and then to optimize the timing, I mean, with no-till systems, you can only plant once the cover crop is blooming. But with a combined system, which works in a way that you let the cover crop grow up, and then you flail mow it down at any point of its vegetative state. So that could be any point in spring. And then on this flailed down cover crop, you spread the fresh hay or the fresh clover grass cuttings or alfalfa cuttings to kind of smother the cover crop. What we know from the pure no-till systems is that if you flail mow your cover crop too early, it will regrow and grow back. But if you combine it with the deep mulch systems, the kind of heavy hay mulch or clover grass cutting mulches, then this thick layer of mulch kind of smothers the cover crop, even if you flail mow it in an early stage. And we found that that's the most flexible system because you can kind of flail mow the cover crop at any time in spring, whenever you want to put your transplants in. You amend the flailed cover crop with the clover grass cuttings, and then you again no-till into this combined mulch layer if you want.
How long after that flail mowing can you plant? Like after the flail mowing and mulching?
Directly. especially with fresh mulch. There's no problem at all. If you use, is haylage the right term?
Haylage, silage, yeah. So partially decomposed lactobacillus. Yeah, when you have lactic acid bacteria, break it down a little bit.
We found if you spread that as the second layer of mulch, or also in the pure transfer mulch systems, that you would need to wait for maybe a week or two until the mulching material doesn't smell like lactic acid anymore, like till it smells neutral, so to speak. Because otherwise, we found that in some situations you get some, we don't really know what it is yet, but there are some gaseous evaporations from this silage or haylage that can damage the young transplants. So with fresh clover grass or like alfalfa grass cuttings, you can plant directly, and with haylage silage, you would have to wait 1 or 2 weeks.
Okay, so I want to go through kind of each piece of this a little bit more in detail, because that's a really cool system, and I definitely really love that idea of having the overwintered cover crop, flail mowing that, and then mulching over top of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's start with the sort of setup of the hay fields where that grass is coming from, where that sort of mulch is coming from. What is the setup of that hay field? Like, what kind of grasses are you using, or what you said, mixture of perennial legumes and stuff? Can you talk about getting that set up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also maybe a difference that I can kind of point out between what I found between European and U.S. organic farming, is that traditionally in organic farming in Europe, you would have a crop rotation within which you would have 2 years of perennial forages. So you would have 2 years of alfalfa grass, for example, or clover grass. So whenever I'm talking alfalfa, clover grass, or forage, I mean a mixture of perennial grasses and clovers. So I'm not so much familiar with the perennial grasses in English, but with the clovers, it would be some kind of mix of red clover, white clover, alfalfa, those kind of crops. And since that's traditionally the case in organic farming, that you would have these 2 years or 1 year, depending on the farm structure, you have that kind of in your rotation anyways for several reasons. One is like enhancing soil health. I mean, in those forage years, you only cut your forage and you don't do any tillage. You have a lot of exudates from the roots. You have deep root penetration. So these kind of 2 years of forage regenerate your soil. That's been one of the ideas in traditional organic farming, I would say. And the second would be, of course, the nitrogen fixation. So the clover in those mixtures is the main fertility driver in those rotations. Like, it fixes nitrogen over 2 years, and then that nitrogen runs through the rest of the rotation. So after these 2 years of clover grass, you would then start with some heavy feeding crops, and then as further away as you get from your clover grass, the less nutrient demanding crops would be grown. So traditionally, you would have this clover grass in your rotation in organic farming. And actually, we came up with this idea of using this as a mulching material because we have, like everywhere, I guess, a specialization also in organic farming. So we don't have these nice mixed farms where you would have livestock and arable cropland and then some vegetables growing, but you have more specialization. So there was a question of what do we actually do with this forage that grows there that people would traditionally still have in their rotation but wouldn't have a use of. So that's how we actually came up in the first place with putting these systems in place, that we said, well, if you don't have livestock to feed this stuff to, then use it as a mulching material and don't leave it just on the spot where it grows, but cut it and transfer it to your crop field. So that's maybe the background to where the hay comes from or where the forage comes from. Yeah.
Okay, so then what tools are you using to cut and collect it?
That depends on the size of the farm. I mean, we have small farms which have like these bit hard to explain maybe, but these flail choppers that kind of that are combined with, for example, a manure spreader. So you have your flail mower next to your tractor, flail chopping the forage and then kind of blowing it onto the manure spreader, and then you de-link your flail chopper and drive the manure spreader to your vegetable beds and spread the mulching material with your manure spreader. There are other bigger farms where you maybe wouldn't have your own equipment, but you would ask some kind of service provider who has bigger machinery who have like these self-propelled or self-driven flail choppers, and then a bigger compost spreader that kind of has maybe a width of spreading of like maybe 16 meters or something, where you can spread several beds with mulching material. And then you would do it that way. So depending on the scale of your operation, you would use different equipment, but it's always some kind of chopping equipment and some kind of spreader that you would use.
Right. I'm seeing more and more people using flail mower collectors for instance, turning over a bed or something, going over top of the bed, pulling all that material off and putting it into the collector and then composting it or reapplying it. I think that's a really cool setup. So then you mentioned compost spreaders. So is there anything particular about these compost spreaders that are sort of spreading out the mulch? Is there anything in particular of how those are designed, or is it?
No, those are standard compost spreaders. Like there's no adjustment needed. Like from the tendency, I would say if you use a manure spreader, the mulch can be like the cutting length of the clover grass cuttings can be a bit longer in the manure spreader. The spreaders are like they are rougher or like broader, so you can work with longer pieces of clover grass, whereas the compost spreaders, you would need to chop the material a little smaller because the spreaders wouldn't be able to handle very long stems of clover or grass. But generally, there's no adjustment that you would need to make.
And the advantage of chopping it up as opposed to, say, cutting it like normal hay is that it just gets you better soil coverage or just better weed suppression?
Well, you want to have an optimal length of the mulching material. So we are always talking about, that's maybe something easy to remember. So we're talking about 7 to 10 centimeters of length of the material, like chopping length, and then also 7 to 10 centimeters thickness of the mulch to suppress the weeds for one whole growing season.
So like a couple to a few inches long.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, so describe a little bit more that planter, and then also maybe like direct seeding versus transplanting. So that planter just splits the mulch, and then you have somebody kind of sitting on a tractor dropping in transplants?
Well, it's now the equipment that's available now is kind of a combined slicer and planter, if you want. So it's got a spinning knife, so to speak. It's a little bit like how do you say? Those mowers? A disc mower, right? That's the word. So basically, you can imagine it as a disc mower turned vertically. So it's also got these knives, and it's instead of slicing horizontally, it's slicing or cutting vertically and slicing the mulch. And then behind this cutter, there is a transplanter directly following that, and that's plugging in the transplant. So it's simply a combination of a slicer, if you want, that's actively powered and slicing open the mulch layer, and then a transplanter that sets the transplant.
And then for direct seeding, is there a lot of direct seeding in this sort of system?
We haven't adapted the system. So for now, we can only transplant, but theoretically, you can also combine a slicer with a precision seeder. We haven't done that yet. It's still up for development, but we've been mostly working with transplant because of the precision you need with direct seeding and the lack thereof with the equipment we have so far. So it's been we've only been working with transplants so far. There have been some farms who've like sliced open the mulch only with the slicer and then kind of went through the rows with a hand seeder, with a precision hand seeder, and they've been successful with that in single instances, but it's not been done on a larger scale, or so that you could say, well, this always works. So we're still developing direct seeding possibilities.
In terms of scale, like what size farms have you seen this implemented on?
Oh, that's very different. I mean, I've seen farms with mostly hand labor who have an acre or less putting this in place. I mean, doing this manually is totally possible and oftentimes quite feasible, I would say. But we also have, I know of one farm which is farming 60 hectares. That would be around like 120 acres, I think. Like a serious large scale vegetable operation, at least for German relations, that is using the system. So when it comes to scale, I think everything is possible. I think the only challenge is economic feasibility for the transplanter. So I think you need to have, if you want to work with this transplanter, then that obviously is an investment, and you need, I think, a certain scale to make it pay. But that's hard to. I think we haven't quite got the. I couldn't tell you the threshold right now, like which size farm it's still feasible and which other size it wouldn't. I mean, that depends on various factors within the operation.
Is it so with the amount of hayfield that you need? Is it directly like 1 acre will supply enough grass? I mean, obviously this gives or take for seasons and all those sorts of things, but roughly like 1 acre per 1 acre of crops, or is it like 2 acres? Like, how does that work?
Well, like you said, I mean, it's very climate dependent and season dependent, because especially the grasses are very demanding when it comes to water. So we've had very serious drought in specific regions, and in some years all over Germany the last 3 years. So forage production has really been an issue. That's on a general note, but like when we have whatever regular is in these times, but when we have regular years in most regions, I would say it's 1-to-1, yes. So you would get 3 cuttings of forage in 1 year. And if you add all these 3 cuttings together, then you can supply 1 acre of vegetable crop land with mulch. But only if you add the 3 cuttings. So say you only have 1 cutting available at the right point in time, let's say mid-May or something, where you plant most of your crops, you would need 3 acres at that specific moment to cover 1 acre of vegetable land. Does that make sense?
I'm trying to imagine. Okay, so the first cutting goes on the field and you can plant into that, but then you get these other 2 cuttings, and where do those go? Like, I think I'm a little unclear on that.
Well, that's the advantage of haylage. So you could, for example, go for the option of saying you want to start, say next year you're saying you want to start the year after, then you could make haylage out of the 3 cuttings, and then this haylage will be able to supply mulch in the coming year for 1 acre. So yeah, the first cutting is mostly used as a fresh mulch, and the 2 cuttings after that are used to make haylage for the coming season.
And you're preferring haylage over just dry hay?
Yes, because there are several disadvantages to hay. First, you need to have the weather to make hay. That can be a problem in some regions in Germany. So it's more prone to climatic misfortunes, so to speak. But the second, I think, more interesting reason is that the haylage and the fermenting process lowers the germination rate of eventual weeds that might be in the mulching material. So you get a kind of hygienization process going on through the fermentation. So that's the second reason. You have more, if you have weeds in your mulching material, then you have more of a problem with that if you don't ferment your mulching material, which is the case for fresh hay or dry hay. And the third reason I would say is that if you make hay and you don't do it, or maybe it's hard to avoid that completely, but if you don't do it properly, then you lose a lot of the leafy material of the clover that kind of remains on the field, and you often harvest mostly the stem. And through that, you lose a lot of nitrogen because it's the leaves, for example, of the clover, which contain most of the nitrogen. So you don't have that problem with haylage, where you preserve the whole plant and you don't lose the leafy parts of the plant.
And then what does the haylage system look like? I think in the United States, I've had neighbors who did corn silage, and then they would they would cut it in the fall, and then they would put that in sort of like these big windrows covered with like thick plastic or inside of plastic, so it was anaerobic. Is that kind of what it looks like? Like, what is it?
That's the same. Yeah. So you could either work in these windrow systems, but I think that's only feasible if in Europe there are certain regulations that you have to fulfill in order to have these kind of large-scale open storage systems with windrows, which you cover with plastic. I think a more feasible system for like smaller-scale vegetable operations would be to bale it in. And that's one disadvantage because you have all the plastic, but that's, I think, the most manageable strategy, that you bale up all the excess hay or forage, and then you have those bales sitting around on your farm, and you can open them and spread them whenever you need the mulching material.
Is there a smaller scale version of that? I guess the bales is an option, but is there like I don't know, have you seen anything creative that would be helpful for somebody on maybe like an acre or less?
Well, I guess then it would be more like a bokashi system or something like that, right? Where you have a larger container where you kind of compress the organic material and keep it airtight, and through that get a lactic acid fermentation. Maybe you use some starters or something like this. But that would be the kind of smaller scale dimension that I could imagine, like some kind of bokashi container system where you preserve the material in bigger containers.
Right. It's like the grass. It's like sauerkraut for grass.
Yes, exactly.
Essentially.
Exactly. Make sauerkraut from your
exactly.
forest. Yeah.
Hey, you all, just jump in here real quick to get a word from our micro sponsor this week, Ramblin' Farmers. Seasoned farm hands are hard to come by, especially for temporary help. With 5 years experience on over 12 farms, Ramblin' Farmers are ready to jump in and help you get the job done. They are independent contractors willing to travel. Learn more at ramblinfarmers.com. Today's show is also brought to you by you, our Patreon members, at patreon.com/farmerjesse. That is the best way to guarantee that this show keeps growing and we're able to do more things, like 3 more podcasts that we're starting, but more on that later. Anyway, at a certain level of the Patreon page, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Mike Trunke, Weaving Roots Farm, Meredith Leet, Lovin' Fresh Flowers, Brenda Fair, Seeds and Soil Farm, Bountiful Harvest Farms, Nate Merkel, Michael Burton, Clinton Dobbs, Marcus Ochoa, Andrew Cousins, Jennifer Sly, Anything Grows Farm, Shauna Eagleton, Brian Hosking, Chris Veretto, David Cianama, Jason Oman, Troy Hinkie, my boy over there at Living Roots Compost Tea, Tony Lopez, Chris Omer, Clement, Liz R., Adam Thielson, Osawaga Farm, Ramblin' Farmers, Aslan Organics, Amber O'Neill, Andrew and Haley Keeler, Francis V., Dan Pratt of Astarte Farm, MF, John Gawley, Tony Lopez, Lawrence from Soul Farm, Millsap Farms, KB, Susan Feathers, Dan Eggert, and KJ/J. Okay, my 2-year-old wrote that one. Big shout out to our Patreon members. Make sure to check that out, patreon.com/farmerjesse. Otherwise, back to the interview.
You mentioned seeing people kind of implement the system manually. I'm imagining, a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are growers on 3 acres, 1 acre or less, so I'm thinking like, what does the sort of manual system look like? Is somebody going out there with like just a basic flail mower, then raking it up? Like, what are some of the smaller versions of this sort of system that you've seen?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could flail it and rake it and fork it on some kind of trailer and then transfer it to the field, unload it, use wheelbarrows, again, fork it on your bed, and then transplant by hand. I mean, especially if you're not large scale, then actually hand planting, it takes a little longer. But then you save all the weeding work that you would have later on in the season. So I think you could take some more time transplanting when compared to like open soil systems. There's also, I've also seen farmers using like tree planting equipment. I don't know if that, like if people have an idea about how this works, but basically it's, basically you punch a hole with a metal pipe that has a sharp ending, and then through that metal pipe you drop your transplant, and then you open the tip of the transplanter, and then the plant drops into the soil, and then you kind of recompact it or press in the transplant with your feet while you're standing. So I've seen farmers doing that as well, and like kind of reinterpreting like forestry or tree planting equipment, for example. And there's also these, in Brazil, for example, where no-till is very widespread, you can also see these very basic manual no-till seeders, which basically only consist of, again, like a spike that just plugs the holes through the mulch and then drops one corn or soybean and then some fertilizer or something like this. There are various kind of creative solutions to the question of transplanting and seeding, I think, when it comes to like small scale systems.
Right. We've used some, not exactly similar to this, but we did a lot of flail mowing of our cover crop this year, and we're able to use an auger on the end of a drill to kind of drill into those beds with pretty good success.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what about, do you know anyone, for people who are in the States or in other countries, I guess, do you know anyone outside of Europe that's sort of implemented this system that farmers can look to?
You mean in other European countries or beyond?
Yeah, sure.
I would say that, for example, in France, there's wide interest in these systems. So I would know of some French farmers who try to implement those systems. There are, and I know the German-speaking regions, so Switzerland and Austria would be countries where people try these systems. But generally, especially with the forage systems, it would need to be countries which aren't like, I think, Mediterranean climates, for example, or also like when it's very dry climate, you get issues growing the forage in decent quantities. So it would need to be temperate climates. But I think wherever there's temperate and relatively moist climate, you have like single farmers trying to implement those systems.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, is if there were areas where it would be less feasible, like you said, drier, more arid regions, it would be more of a challenge, perhaps. Although alfalfa and that sort of stuff does grow decently in the Southwest, I think. Okay, so changing gears a little bit, because I'm sure you run into this situation too. What about managing soil fertility when you don't have access to a hayfield like that? Like, what are some of the other systems that you sort of encourage people to look at?
Well, it's always about maximizing biomass production, I would say, and it really depends on you and your operation how you achieve this. And I think one other major option is if you don't have these separate hay fields that kind of regenerate yourself than it is to work with, for instance, cover crops. And that's where we get into the like regular no-till systems, if you want, even though they are also quite innovative and not so widespread. But using cover crops would be one other large option that we're favoring.
Are you generally favoring anything that involves like compost or deep compost mulches or anything like that?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of talk and also promotion of like the market gardening system also here in Germany, and some quite remarkable like interest of different gardeners. But I think I'm not having a problem with the system, but I think the question is, are they scalable or generalizable? And I think the problem with these deep compost systems is that the amount of compost used in these systems, if you kind of generalize this onto a larger landscape, then we simply don't have enough compost, so to speak. I think that's the issue I see with these deep compost systems, that I think they're not generalizable, I would say. Does that make sense? I mean, we simply don't have enough compost to do this on a large scale, like nationwide or something like this.
Right. Yeah, no, that becomes a problem here too. And then you also maybe run into issues of like, well, one, access to that amount of compost. Also what that amount of compost may mean on like a really large scale in terms of environmental pollution, potentially with nitrogen or some of those, maybe even phosphorus or something like that. One thing I want to jump back to real quick is talking about cutting hay at the right time. For the mulch, can you kind of take us through like when to do that and how, like, what to look for?
Yeah, I think the latest point in time would be like in bloom or just before bloom. I mean, you really don't want the perennial grasses or clovers to set seed and kind of create a weed problem in your vegetable bed then. So that's something you would really need to look out for. Like that's not too, like, yeah, that's basically, it hasn't set seed. And on the other end, if you cut really, really young material, you might not get the kind of length that you're looking for, like the 7 to 10 centimeters, if it's just not long enough, so to speak. And the second, more problematic side of that is that you could run into problems of like the material molding and rotting in a way you don't want, because the CN ratio, I mean, that's always the main point in how quickly a mulching material is decomposed and how fast the nutrients come available, is the CN ratio. And once the CN ratio is too low, you basically just get the material just starts rotting, and you don't have enough airflow and oxygen through the mulching material, and that's something you also don't want. So I would say, like, cutting it before bloom, just right before bloom, is one safe bet. So you don't run into these mold issues, and you also don't run into the seed setting problem.
And then with these fields, okay, so you have one field that's acting as a hay field for a while. And then that goes out of hayfield and goes into crop production, and one of the crop production fields goes into hayfield. Would that be accurate? Like there's like that 2-year rotation?
Exactly. Yeah. So the hayfields rotate through your whole cropland. So they, at some point, you will always have hayland on all of your fields, so to speak. Yeah.
And then we didn't really talk about this very much, but is that the only fertility management? Is there anything else being added to these fields, generally speaking?
The good thing about having those hayfields in the rotation is that you don't only take from those fields and transfer this to other fields, so you don't kind of take out nutrients from one field and add it to the other. But since the hayfields are rotating through all your fields, you have a kind of balanced out nutrient loop, if you want. So wherever the hay fields come at some point before there was mulch on these fields. So kind of the nutrients rotate. Yeah, they just kind of flow through your rotation. So you don't have a field where you only take and another field that only gets, but you kind of run through the whole crop rotation. I think that's one big advantage of this. And I think beyond that, I wouldn't so much look into only the hay fields, but what we usually do is we create a crop rotation balance, if you want. So we look into how much, like say you focus on one field and you kind of look at the field throughout the next, say your crop rotation has 6 years, and you look like you kind of project the coming 6 years. And you look into how much nutrients are exported in your harvested vegetable crops. So, for instance, you have in the first year you have cabbage, so you would kind of project how much phosphorus and how much potassium, for example, and how much sulfur, for example, is contained in this cabbage, for example, and note that down. And then the second year you might have squash. You look into how much nutrients is taken off the field by the squash, and then last year might be carrots, and you look into how much nutrients are taken off by the carrots, and in the end, you have a total. So you have mostly in vegetable production you have a minus if you don't do anything, like you export a lot of those nutrients, and then what I would try to do is kind of balance out these deficiencies by using compost, for example. That's where I like to use organic kind of fertilizers, and so you can even out the potassium and especially phosphorus take out from the vegetable crops through compost. Or you could also use single fertilizers that are allowed in organic farming. So just a pure phosphorus or potassium fertilizer that kind of evens out the nutrients you take out of the soil in the form of your vegetables that you sale. So we would try to close these nutrient loops in that way, kind of project your crop rotation and create an estimate of how much nutrients are taken off, and then even that out with either, like I said, compost fertilizer or like other allowed organic fertilizers.
And those nutrients per crop, forgive me if you said this, but you're getting that information by measuring each individual crop, or that information's just already been recorded by universities or?
We have like those. You have we have just scientific tables that kind of have an average nutrient content for any crop you want. Like those numbers are available. It's more like, I think the trick is, if you want to make it really exact, is that you would have some kind of Excel spreadsheet, and you would kind of have all these data integrated in your spreadsheet, and then you have your rotation on another spreadsheet, and then it kind of calculates automatically what kind of taken off the field. And throughout the years, if you know, I mean, that's also working with average yields or like yields you want to achieve. So throughout the years, you can also adjust these kind of rough estimates with more precise numbers that kind of go along with the real, like the actual yields that you have. But those numbers are readily available.
Okay, so I have sort of a specific question. All right, so let's say that, and we can kind of use me as an example here. Let's say that my best crop ground is already in crops, and like I need kind of every bit of it to supply my market. But I have, some like less desirable ground that I could put into something like a hay field for this specific purpose. But that's not ground that I'd ever really want to grow crops on. So like, let's say that I do that and I have these hay fields and I'm taking, but I'm never giving back. Like I'm never putting that back into the crop rotation. Is that something you would recommend? And then how would you, if so, like what would you fertilize those with? Does that make sense? Like maybe they're kind of hilly or rocky, like not the perfect for crop production.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, you can do it in that way, and then you always have these kind of set hay fields which are only designated for mulch production, and the cropping land where you only use the mulch. But then you would need to do the same with the forage fields, like calculate an estimate on how much nutrients you take off those fields in form of forage. And forage is actually quite a heavy nutrient load that you take off those fields. I mean, the mulch itself is a very potent fertilizer, so you take off a lot of potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen from these fields. Nitrogen isn't so much the problem, of course, because it's kind of it's fixed by the clover. But with all the other nutrients, potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, you would do the same as you would in a rotating system that I just described. So you would calculate how much do you take off annually of that field in form of nutrients, and then re-fertilize that ground so it stays productive. Otherwise, you just basically suck out all the nutrients from the hayfield and nothing grows eventually, once all nutrients are gone. So you would do the same fertilizing system, I think, that I just proposed. So you would use some compost if you have access to this. You would maybe use your the vegetable waste you might have on your farm. And again, you might use single fertilizers to even out the nutrients you take off the hay mulch production field, so to speak.
Are animals ever involved in this process? Are you ever grazing those areas or running chickens over them for nitrogen or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I think a common misunderstanding, I think, for organic farming is that kind of animals close the loop, where I would always stress that animals don't produce nutrients. They only eat plants that might have fixed nutrients like nitrogen, but they don't create nutrients, so to speak. So you could graze those hayfields too, but for once, you need the mulching material, so you wouldn't usually do that if mulch production is your goal. And second, they don't refeed nutrients. They just let nutrients run through their body if you want. So I don't think, I'm always, I think it's a common misunderstanding that animals bring nutrients into the system. They just, they just transform nutrients from one form in the other.
Right. They're doing some sort of fermentation in their rumens or, in their stomachs.
Yes.
And then with something like chickens, you are having to import some amount of grain, so it's not a closed loop. Although their manure tends to have high nitrogen, it's not not necessarily a closed loop situation.
Yeah, but you could calculate that, of course, as well. If you have chickens running on your hayfield and you feed them certain feed stock, then you could calculate how much nutrients are contained in the feed, and then deduct that from the fertilization you do on the hayfield. But then your fertilizer is basically the feed and not the chicken itself,
right,
to speak. Does that make sense? So the soybean, for example, is kind of replenishing the phosphorus and potassium then on that field.
Right, that's interesting.
Like the soybean you feed to the chicken, so to speak.
Right. And my thinking was I was just wondering if people were doing it, not necessarily in the mid-season, like you said, with, you want that mulch, but maybe in the winter or late in the fall after you've got that second or third cutting, to be able to replenish it for the spring. But yeah, it's interesting. What about in terms of let's say you do have it in a sort of perennial hay mulch, are you staggering grasses? Are you using spring grasses like rye and then maybe a fall grass in there as well, some orchard grass or something for summer? Do you mix those? Would you recommend mixing those grasses, or is that kind of just unnecessary?
What we're doing in I think that kind of goes into that direction is that if you want to establish an alfalfa grass or a clover grass, for example, we always recommend using a nurse crop. So we would always use, say you want to establish your clover or forage grasses in autumn, then we would, for example, use a rye veg mix and undersow in one go, seed the rye veg and then add the forage mix that you want to seed. And then the kind of forage germinates below the rye and veg. And then in the coming spring, you have your rye and veg growing. You can kind of flail chop that, use it as a mulch, and then your perennial forages regrow from below through the stubbles of the rye veg. And the same goes for spring seedings of forage. So if you seed your alfalfa grass or your clover grass in spring, you could use like an oat summer veg mix to kind of nurse your clover grasses or your forage. You would kind of flail chop that as a mulch and then have your forage grow from underneath that. So that kind of stacking is something we do. But you always end up with hopefully a good stand of perennial grasses and clovers, and then we just use that stand for mulch production.
That's great. So, okay, so let's say somebody wants to try this system. What are some mistakes that growers make in trying to implement it?
They might not use enough mulch, so to speak. So they put a layer that's too thin, and then throughout the growing season it decomposes too quickly, and you have weeds growing through, and then you can't do your regular weeding, and then weeding becomes takes just a lot of time because you have to manually hand weed. So that's, I think, one issue. The second issue that we've also run into when we were very enthused about the system is that you start mulching very early in the season. So say we've started as early as beginning of April or something like this. And with this, you insulate your soil, so you don't allow your soil to warm up enough, and then you insulate it in this cold state, and that kind of demobilizes a lot of nutrients and makes the cash crop grow much slower than you would usually be used to. So that could be a problem, like starting too early. Another issue could be nutrient availability. So we always recommend to analyze your mulching material when it comes to, like, for example, nitrogen content, so and CN ratio. So I think it's important to know the CN ratio and the nitrogen content of the mulching material you use, and with sort of those, and the amount, of course, you spread or use as a mulch. And with these three factors, you can calculate how much nitrogen is released in one growing season. And depending on the CN ratio and the nitrogen content, and of course the thickness of the mulch itself might not be enough nitrogen to feed, for example, a heavy feeding crop of, let's say, broccoli or something like this. And that would mean that you need to amend an extra amount of like organic nitrogen fertilizer to add up to the need of the crop. So I think fertility management and nitrogen calculation, like how much you need to fertilize, is quite key also in these mulching systems. A lot of farmers think, okay, I'm using the mulch, there's a lot of nutrients in there, and that would just be enough for my crop without actually crunching the numbers. So I think that's important too, to have a good overview of your fertility management. I think that's the main points I can think about right now. And of course, I mean, technological or like limitations when it comes to machinery is always a big point. Like, I mean, these systems are pretty new, and having the transplanting equipment or having the roller crimper or whatever, I mean, you need a lot of different pieces of equipment to make, or like ideas on how to put this into place with the technology you have on your farm, and that always can be limitations. So kind of figuring out the technical side of it is also a challenge for many farms, I would say.
Yeah. Can you remind us what that depth of mulch is, what like your ideal depth is? I think you said it in the beginning, but
yeah, it's 7 to 10 centimeters is the thickness of the mulch, and then again, like I said, 7 to 10 centimeters is the length also of the choppings you want to have.
Right, so at least 2 to 3 inches of mulch.
Okay. Yeah.
Plastics or synthetics for warming up the soil? Is there any sort of Like, do you ever recommend that sort of thing, like using landscape fabric? I know a lot of people are opposed to it. We don't really use it on our farm, but for a larger scale farm that needs to warm up their soil a little faster, do you ever recommend those sorts of
Yeah,
things?
actually, it's something I want to look into more in the future, and I think that's also. I mean, I've been inspired a lot by like organic farmers and researchers in the United States. So I'm aware of a lot of work, especially in the Northeast, in the US, of using tarps to kind of warm the soil and at the same time kill cover crops. So I can actually recommend the work of Natalie Lounsbury. She's doing, I think, a blog called No-Till Veggies. I don't know if you've interviewed her, but if you haven't, I think she's a good guest for your show. That's something. I mean, she's looking into like more regular no-till systems with tillage radish before, but now they're looking into, as far as I'm aware, into using not landscape fabric, but like I said, different types of tarps that you would put onto a living cover crop, for example, and through occultation, like meaning no light that can penetrate anymore through the tarp. That through this the cover crops die, and then you take off the tarp, like say 2 or 3 weeks after you've applied it. Cover crop has died, and then you transplant into the tarp cover crop, so to speak. And the results I've seen have been really promising. I think that's a good bet, especially for regions which are colder and where, for example, like in a regular no-till system, you can't wait till the cover crop is in full bloom. So I think tarping really allows for a lot of flexibility. And I think especially for smaller scale operations, it's interesting. And actually, I'm in touch with some farmers here in Germany where we're thinking about how we can scale up the tarping system, because those tarps, often like silage tarp, for example, so the same material you use on those windrows to create the fermentation that are used to smother the cover crops, for example. And I think we can find some kind of mechanization that allows for this to be scaled up. And I mean, the tarps you can reuse them for several years. I mean, you still have the plastic problem always, or often you run into this, but I think that's really promising. And yeah, that's just something I came up with right now. And when you asked about the fabrics used in these systems, so they can be combined for like realizing no-till systems as well.
Yeah, that's great. One farm that really uses that well is Frith Farm in Maine. He'll have a book coming out in November that uses those tarps in a really effective way. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that before we close?
No, I just, because we haven't talked about it a lot, I think I just really want to stress the feasibility of these combined mulch systems, like where you work with the cover crop, which you flail down, and then you combine it with the chopped clover and grass cuttings. So I think those are the systems that we've found to be most reliable. And that could also be a combination, like I said, between tarping a young cover crop and then amending transferred mulch and then planting through these combined mulch layers. So I just wanted to stress that what we found is these pure no-till systems with roller crimping cover crops have their risks, and that also the kind of pure transferred mulch systems have their risks, and that the most reliable systems we found are these combined mulching systems where you combine cover crops with transferred mulch. I think that's something I just wanted to stress.
Well, Jan-Hendrik, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your practices. This has been a super enlightening conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on your show. And if anybody wants to get in touch, I'm sure you will have my contact details on your webpage. I'm in the States once in a while, so feel free to keep in touch and ask questions after the show through my email address or website.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, Jan-Hendrik does not do the social medias, but you can find out more info about his work at bodenfruchtbarket.net, which I totally nailed the pronunciation there. But just in case you didn't catch it, we will have the links in the show notes and at no-tillgrowers.com. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're getting it. Leave a review, black ink only, and don't forget to follow the directions exactly and sign the envelope. Otherwise, your review won't be counted. It could end up in the Supreme Court with contested reviews. I don't know, just be a mess. Anyway, huge thank you to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin for their help. Thanks to Willie Breeding for the theme music. Thank you times a million to my wife, Hannah, for all her help. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.
I think it's like a really interesting system, and I imagine that it's going to immediately have some spin-offs, like people are going to take this and run with it.